Hi dear students, in this video I would like to show you a little bit more information about using Entity Framework in ASP.NET Core applications. Unfortunately, I will not be in school tomorrow, so I record this lesson. You can watch it on YouTube and then you can start working on the example that I gave you 2 weeks ago. The example, just to refresh your memory, was this bike rental sample. You have the link to the GitHub Classroom already in your Webuntis, so please take it from there. This is the big example that you should work on in the next 1 or 2 weeks. And in this video, I want to show you how you basically start a project that uses Entity Framework in an ASP.NET Web API project. This is what we are going to do today. If you would like to follow along, please start a new project in Visual Studio 2019 and also open the Entity Framework ASP.NET Core cheat sheet that you see here. You will need this cheat sheet because it contains some important information. We already discussed it, like Nougat package names and commands and code snippets that you can copy. So let's get started. Here I have Visual Studio 2019 and I'm going to start with a brand new project, create new project. We are going to create an ASP.NET Core web application. This looks good. Let's take this one, next, and let's give it a name. I prepared an empty folder here. In my case, it is called this one, and I will call it ASP.NET Entity Framework API. Okay, so I can use this one, place it in the same folder, and this one. This looks good. You can choose any name that you want. Go on, create. Visual Studio will now create the project. .NET Core is fine. ASP.NET Core 3 is also fine. Let's take an API. We don't need HTTPS for the moment, so yeah, that looks reasonable. Let's hit create. Now Visual Studio will create the empty project. It does not contain Entity Framework yet. We will have to add Entity Framework in the next steps. So here we are in Visual Studio 2019 with our new project. If we start this project, remember to switch from IIS Express to the name of the project in order to start it as a console app. Just give it a try to start it. It should come up as a console app and it should give us some basic information in the form of a JSON file because we have created an API app and not a web application. Chrome comes up and shows us some JSON. So the creating of the project worked fine. We can start writing code. In our case, we want to add Entity Framework and we want to add Entity Framework for SQL Server. Therefore, we have to install a Nougat package. You can find the name of the Nougat package in the cheat sheet. I will show you what you have to do. Right-click, Manage Nougat Packages, go to Browse and paste in Microsoft Entity Framework Core SQL Server because we are going to use SQL Server in our case. Everybody should have SQL Server installed at this point of the course. If you don't, please download it and install it locally or run the Docker image that I showed you that you can download from the Docker Hub. Install Microsoft Entity Framework Core SQL Server. Good. It will only take a few seconds. And the second project, the second Nougat package that you have to install is called Microsoft Entity Framework Core.design. Let's install this one too. Looks good. Now you should have an ASP.NET Core application based on ASP.NET Core 3, as you can see it here, and you should have SQL Server and Entity Framework Core Design installed in your project. Could you follow along so far? I hope so. If you could, we can make the next step. The next step is to create the modal classes. I encourage you to create a folder. Let's call this folder modal. And inside of the modal folder, we will create our modal classes. To keep things simple, I will create a single file where I put all the modal classes in. In reality, if your modal becomes more complex, you should create a new file for each modal class. But for me, for this simple demo, it's fine to create a single C# file where we can now add multiple classes. Let's make a very simple modal. Let's create a modal where we have books and books have authors. Just 2 tables, that's fine. In the homework, in your bike rental example that I showed you before that you have in GitHub, you will have to create a more complex modal. But for this simple walkthrough, we will keep things really simple. So let's start with an author. An author has a property of type string. It's the first name of the author, and another one, it's the last name of the author. And maybe we can also add a third property, and let's say this is the nationality. This is the country where the author comes from. The second modal class, this one, will be the modal class for a book. A book has a title and a book might have a date, time, publish date. Looks good. So this would be very simple properties for the author and the book entities. If we want to store these entities in a database, it's a good idea to add some additional properties. You have these properties named in your cheat sheet, and the first one that I would like to use here is the ID property. So we will add an integer ID to the author table, and we will add an ID to the book. Because it is called ID, Entity Framework will recognize the column and will create it as the primary key. It will automatically generate a new primary key for the ID for every book and every author. And then we can use the ID as a foreign key because a single book can have multiple authors. So ID is a good thing. Please remember, I mentioned that before. Theoretically, you could add a so-called data annotation here on top of the ID column, this one, key, and this would explicitly say that ID should be the key. It's not necessary if you call it ID. If you don't call it ID, but a different name, the property, then you have to add the key if you really want to have a key. But let's keep things simple and let's put it like that. The next thing where we definitely need a data annotation is something like required. So what we can do is we can say, give me here a required attribute, and that means that the title must not be null. We can add multiple of these data annotations. Please take a look at the cheat sheet to learn more about available data annotations. I will also move this required up here to the first name and to the last name because these 2 columns should be required in the author table. Okay? Nationality shouldn't be required, it should be optional, therefore I leave it out. It's up to you where you set these properties. Please note that there is a different option, another option where you can add things like required and so on. The DB context, the class that we will create later on, has a virtual method which is called onModalCreating, and there I could also add some additional so-called fluent APIs to set these properties. But I mentioned that before. I think it's easier to just add the attributes here. Most of the things can be done here, not all of the things, but as I said, let's keep things simple. That's good. So now what's missing in our modal class is the relation between book and author. As I told you, a single book can have, again, let's simplify things, a single author. So what I'm going to do is first I will create a property of type int which I call author ID. Please note that it's called like the table that we reference up here, and the name of the property has the postfix ID, and therefore Entity Framework recognizes that this should be a foreign key to the ID column up here. As I said, in real life, a book can have multiple authors, but we will keep things simple. The second thing is we will add a property of type author, as you can see it here, and I will also call it author. This will make it easier from C# to reference the author up here, and we can also say that every book must have an author. So let's add the required attribute here to indicate that every book must have an author. On the other hand, a single author can write multiple books. So let's put here a property of type list of book, something like this, and let's call it books. Okay, so this is the reference from the author to all his books, and this is the reference from the book to the author, and this is the foreign key to the author table. Everything's fine so far? Could you follow along? If you have it like this, please try to build your application. It should compile successfully. Yes, I have it here. Build successful. Please follow along so that your Modal class looks like this. Press pause on the video if you have any problems, and we will continue once you have the code set up like I show it to you here. Let's continue with our example, and now we are going to create the database context, the so-called DB context. How do we do that? We create a new class. Maybe we should add first a folder here. I think that would be a good idea. Let's call it data. And inside of the data folder, we will create a class which we will call book DB context. You can choose any name, but I think this is a meaningful name for our small example here. This book DB context is derived from DB context, and this class comes from Entity Framework. Inside the DB class, we will have to create properties of type DB set of for each table, so it is a DB set of book. We are missing a using here. Let's edit, and let's call this thing books. This is the entry point that we will use for queries against the database and also for inserting books and things like that. And again, create a DB set of author for our authors. This is the most important thing that you have to do for each table in your database. Add a property of type DB set with the type of the Modal class that represents the table inside the database. Can you remember a few minutes ago I mentioned a class where you can add some Fluent API to define your modal? Let me quickly demonstrate that. You do not need to follow along what I write here. I just want to point it out to show you where you use this Fluent API, because sometimes you need it. If you want to learn more, take a look at the cheat sheet. You will find a link to the documentation there. So if I say override here and use the onModal creating here, I will get a generated method, and here I can specify details about the modal. I could, for instance, say modal builder. Here you see the modal builder dot entity of book. This will give me a reference to the book entity. Then I can say property, and here, oh sorry, I have to call this, of course, this is a method, I'm sorry. Let's call this book, and the book, for instance, title, and then I can say required. You see? This code where I say the title of the book is required has the same effect. Then if we go to the Modal class, the title of the book is required. It's just another way of writing those specifications of the modal. As I told you, most of the things can be expressed like this, but A few things cannot be expressed like this, so sometimes you definitely need this, and if I can remember it correctly, in the bike rental example, you need a few of these things. So make yourself familiar with this by reading the documentation linked in the cheat sheet, or by just exploring IntelliSense here, because if you say modal builder here .entity of author, something like this, and you say dot, then you can look through these methods. Many of these methods have very meaningful names, and therefore you will probably immediately understand what they do. If you don't, take a look at the documentation. So for our simple example, we currently do not need this on modal creating function, so we can delete it for now, and we are good with the books and the authors table. The next thing that we have to do for our small little application is we have to add the connection string to the app settings JSON file. In my case, I will use the local DB. I have SQL Server installed locally. In your case, the connection string will look different, but the general principle is the same. I will copy a setting from the cheat sheet. I have it on a different monitor here. Please open the cheat sheet and copy it from there, and it should look like that. You define connection strings, then you define the default collection, and I told you in my case, my SQL Server is called localDB dev. In your case, it will probably look different. Database equals to address book. No, let's just call it books and authors, for instance, and trusted connection true means I will use my Windows credentials. In your case, you might use user and password depending on your settings. Please choose the settings in the settings file accordingly. Once we have the connection string in app settings, we can link the connection string in app settings with Entity Framework, and this is done in the startup class. So let's quickly recap. First, we create the modal. Second, we create the database context. Third, we create the setting, the connection string in app settings JSON, and now we switch to startup CS, where we can link all these things together. Let's do that. As you can see here in the startup constructor, we already get eye configuration. You should be familiar by now with eye configuration because we covered that in a previous lecture. And from this configuration, we will read the connection string. And we will do that as follows. We go to configure services here, and we will add with services.add_db context, we will add our database context. We have to give it the type of our database context. This is the book DB context. This is the context that we created a few moments ago. Here, this one, see, book DB context. And here we can now take the options. This is a parameter that we get in this callback method, and these options have a bunch of use statements. And because we have installed our Nougat package for Entity Framework Core and SQL Server, we can say options use SQL Server. We are missing a using, you see, at Entity Framework Core, and now we have use SQL Server. This use SQL Server requires a connection string, and we want to read the connection string from the configuration. So let's say configuration, and in square brackets, the name of the setting from the app settings JSON. So from here, I take the connection string, this one, then a subsetting is the default connection, and we separate the name of the object from the subsetting with a colon, and now we are done. Don't worry, you don't need to learn that by heart, because let me quickly show you the cheat sheet. Here on the cheat sheet, I have written all this code for you. So during the exam or later on during your Matura, if you take this cheat sheet with you, or at least parts of it, then you can copy this code into your project, and it will be pretty simple and pretty straightforward. The last thing that we should finally do is we should add a constructor to the database context. You see that one? I will simply copy this constructor out from the cheat sheet. You can do the same if you want. Go to the database context, add the constructor, and we can leave the default implementation as you see it here. The only thing is we have to change the name of our database context and we are fine. That looks good. Let's try to compile our application. Should be done in a second. Yes, build successful. If you try it, your application should also build successfully. So please pause this video, try to set up everything as I showed you. If necessary, copy things from the cheat sheet and continue the video once your application compiles successfully. Does your application compile successfully? I hope so. So we are ready for the next step. Please open a file explorer for your project. I right-click on the project and open File Explorer, and that will give me the Explorer here, and I will open a command shell in the folder. In this folder, please check that you have the CS proj file in the folder that you have just opened. In this folder, we have to create the entity framework migrations. Can you remember from the last sessions, from the last lectures, what the migrations are? If you can't, please rewatch the previous video that I did, I think 2 weeks ago, together with you. If you can remember, just follow along. .NET EF migrations add, and let's call it initial. This will add migrations. Please remember, migrations are the database code, the C# code that can create the database from scratch. It will create tables, add properties to the tables and things like that. So let's run that one. Your database must be available. When you run this statement, it will only take a few moments. And after a few moments, you should see a success message. And then we'll take a look back in our project because it should generate a little bit of code in our project. That looks good. It says done. Let's take a look. As you can see here in the project, we have now a folder migrations with a little bit of generated code. And as you can see it here, it generated some code to create tables, to create primary keys like here with an identity column. Identity means that the value of the primary key is generated automatically. So this worked well. You will have to rerun this statement whenever you change something in the modal classes. So if you add, for instance, a new property here and you would like to update your database, then you have to rerun this statement in order to create new migrations. And these migrations will have to have a new name. For instance, something like add new property migration or whatever you want to call it. Next one, we can update the database. .NET EF database update. This will now really connect to the database server and use the migrations to create the tables, to create the properties, the columns in the tables and things like that. Let's see if it works. It should only take a few moments and everything should be fine. It will now try to connect to my local DB database server. And it shows me all the information, what tables it creates. Please take a look that you see things like not null, not null. If you take a look at the code here, we have our required attributes. They result in not null statements in the SQL table. So everything looks pretty nice. Let's take a look in the database. I will open my SQL Server Management Studio. There are many tools available with which you can open a SQL Server. I personally use the SQL Server Management Studio because it's freely available and it is pretty powerful. It contains a lot of features. There are also free versions of database tools available. There is also a plugin for Visual Studio Code. You can do it from within Visual Studio, but in this example, I will use the SQL Server Management Studio. Let's connect to localDB/dev and use Windows authentication. Let's connect. Let's take a look databases. And in our case, we called it books and authors. And as you can see it here, we have our books and authors with the author table and the books table. And we see the primary keys and the foreign keys exactly as we expected it to be. Of course, these tables are currently empty. We can try it. Just open a new query window here and let's say select star from authors, something like this. Let's run it and the table is currently empty, of course. So this is fine. We have created the migrations. We have updated the database. And we are ready to go. We are ready to take the next step, write a bunch of ASP.NET controllers that allow us to insert records to the database, to delete records from the database, to query some records from the database, and so on. So, did you successfully run the migration-related statements in the console? If not, maybe rewind the video, try to update your database, pause the video until you have the database set up correctly as I show you here, and continue once everything runs on your machine. Do you have the database set up as I showed you? Very good. Then we can take the next step. Now we want to build a web API through which we can access our database table, our entity framework modal. Luckily, we don't have to write the whole API controllers by hand. We have done that in the last weeks over and over again. I showed you how to create a controller, how to create get and post and put and patch methods and things like that. But Visual Studio knows a few tricks which are very useful when it comes to Entity Framework. Try to follow along. Right-click on the controllers folder here, select Add Controller. And as you can see here, you have a bunch of selections, and in our case, we want to create an API controller, which could be the backend for our mobile app, for instance, and we use the Entity Framework. So please select that one, API controller with actions using Entity Framework. Add. Then you see the modal class, and the first thing that I would like to do together with you is author. Let's select author because we want to have a controller with which we can maintain all possible book authors. Select the data context class, this one, and select the controller name, authors controller. Looks good, hit add. This will now install a bunch of Nougat packages, as you can see it here. We can let it install these Nougat packages, that is fine. And at the end of the day, it will generate a little bit of C# code and add it to our controllers folder. Let's give it a few moments. This whole process is called scaffolding. It means it generates code from our structures that we have created in Entity Framework. Only a few more moments. And then we should be able to take a look at the generated classes. Here we are. You see, we now have the authors controller, and by the way, the weather forecast controller, it's a generated controller. We don't need it, so we can delete it from here, and you can also delete the weather forecast class here. That's just demo data that was, demo code that was generated by Visual Studio when we created the project. For our cases, it's just the authors controller, which is interesting. As you can see it here, it injects the bookDB context into our constructor. You already know about dependency injection. If you don't, please rewatch the videos that we created a few weeks ago. We have a controller base class, and we have an API controller exactly as we expected it. And you see, you automatically get all the code necessary to get all the authors, to get a single author by ID, to put an author, that means update an author, to post an author, that means add an author, it's an insert statement, to delete an author, that means we delete a single author by ID, and that's it. And we didn't have to create a single line of code. All we had to do is we had to create the modal classes, we had to create the data context, do a little bit of wire up in the startup class, and all the rest was generated automatically. I would like to give this a try. Let's do that. Let's create the application. Let's run the application. I will run it immediately inside of the debugger. Good. And then I will go here and set a breakpoint in the post author method. You see? Now we have the breakpoint set here. Let's give it a try and let's call our web API. We need a tool to call the web API. If you would like to use Postman or Insomnia, feel free to do so, but in my case, I would like to use the REST client in Visual Studio Code. So therefore, I open up here the File Explorer, the folder where we are, and maybe here I will open the folder in Visual Studio Code. I'm pretty much familiar with the REST client in Visual Studio Code, but as I told you, if you would like to use Postman instead, feel free to do so. So let's create a helper variable. Let's call it host HTTP localhost 5000/API. Oops, I didn't want to do that. Why API? So just to refresh your memory, up here we have API / and it says controller, authors controller. So good, let's do that one. Let's call the post method host, this one, authors, because we have API / authors. We want to give it a content type of type JSON. And let's take a look at the modal. If we take a look at the modal, you see author has a first name, a last name, and a nationality. We do not have to specify the ID because this primary key will be generated by the database. We do not have to specify a list of books because, well, we can't insert books yet because we haven't created the books controller. So all we need is first name, last name, and nationality. Let's do that. First name should be Fu. The last name should be Bar. And the nationality should be, for instance, Austrian. Looks good. Remember, we have a breakpoint here in our authors controller. Here it is. So if we run this guy here, we should be able to see this breakpoint. Just to make sure, I will stop the application and restart the debugger, just so I have a clean slate here. I can start from scratch. Yes, looks good. Now the breakpoint is active. And let's send this request. Success. You see, we are here in the post method, and if I take a look, we have foo bar 0 at, and as you can see, the generated code will add the new author to my database table. It will save the changes to the database, and it will return a created HTTP status code 201, and it will give me back the generated ID. Let's try that. Let's just continue this running, and let's see what we get here. You see, we get a 201 created, we get foo bar at, we don't get any books, that's correct, because we don't have created books yet, but we also get the new primary key. So if we add a second one, let's say this is John Doe, and John comes from, for instance, the United States. Let's send a post request. Again, everything is fine. Let's run it, and we get back the ID number 2. And just to prove the point, I will run the select statement here in SQL Server Management Studio. And as you can see here, we have John Doe and foo bar created to our table. The very important point that I would like to make here is do not manually create the authors controller here. That's the important thing. That will be very important in your exam, and it will be very important in your Matura. What you essentially do is you create the modal, you create the database context, you do the setup in the startup project, in the startup file, as I showed you before, and then you can generate the authors controller just as you like. Okay? So let's recap that or repeat that with the books. Right click on the controllers, add controller, API controller. We did that before. This time I will select the book table and let's call it books controller and hit add. The system will recognize that it has already installed the necessary Nougat packages, so adding the books controller will be faster. As you can see here, everything is fine. We have a get book, we have a put book, we have a post book to add a book, and we have a delete book. That looks, yeah, pretty nice. Let's try this. Let's try to create new books. Run the API. Good. Let's take a look at the modal. What does a book consist of? A title, a publish date, and the author. How do we specify the author? Well, using the author ID. Let me show you what I mean with that. Let's add a new post statement. Again, we access the host, but this time we go to books. Again, we have the content type, which is JSON, as you can see it here, and we specify the content of the book. The first one is the title. I don't know. My quest. I don't know. Any title that you like. The next one is the publish date. The publish date could be a date in the format, I don't know, 2019, 11/01, and we don't need a time, something like this. And last but not least, we would like to assign it to an author. Let's quickly check that. Author 1 is Fubar from Austria. So let's try this one. Author ID, we specify author ID, and we say this should be 1. So this book will be assigned to the author Fubar. Let's try that. Let's send the request. And we have a problem. The author field is required. Oh, I made a mistake because I added the required field up here, and that is a big problem. I have to fix that by moving this required field up to the author ID and stop it and rebuild the application. I'm very sorry. I forgot that one. I did that one wrong. It should be on the foreign key here. Good. Let's try it again. Sorry that I did that wrong. Let's run this guy. And you see, good. Created. Title, the book is ID 1. My quest. The publish date is correct. And the author ID is 1. So let's check that in the database. Let's say select star from books. Good. Let's run this guy. And you can see here 1, my quest, publish date, and the author is 1. It worked perfectly fine. So if I go now back and say give me a list of books, I can just say get host / books, and we should see the book. Here it is. See? And if we say get host authors, we should see a list of all authors. However, if you take a close look, you will see that if we run the books, our author ID is present, but the author is not. So what we could do if we want to return not only the books, but also the author of the book with a single HTTP request, without having to take a look at the ID and run a second query, which should say something like this. I could do it in 2 steps. I could do this. I could then take the ID, move it here, and do a second request and get the details. What if I want to get in a single request the book plus the author? How can I do that? I can do that by making a slight change here in our authors, no, in the books controller. Because if we take a close look, the get books here just returns the books, and it turns out that Entity Framework has a very useful function which is called include. You see it here? And I can say please include the book.author, and if I just add this include, Entity Framework will give me the author for every book automatically without me having to do anything else. So let's try it again. Once we added the include clause here, we can run this again. Good. Books. Give it a try. It's running. Oh, we get an error. Oh, a possible object cycle was detected. Yes, that's perfectly correct. This is an error that you see very frequently when you work with Entity Framework and with modal classes like that. So let me describe what the problem is. The problem is that here in Modal we have an author with a list of books, as you can see it here. Now every book has an author, and with that we have a cycle. We have a cycle And this cycle means that the author references the book and the book references the author. We have to break this cycle in one way or the other. The simplest way is to get rid of the books here. That would work. It's only an intermediate solution because what if we want to have the books here? But for now, let's quickly comment out these books. So now we no longer have a cycle because the book references the author, but the author does no longer reference back the books. Let's give it a try. I show you this problem, I run into this problem to show you a typical problem that you have with Entity Framework and ASP.NET Core 3 today. This is something that many people struggle with, and therefore I wanted to demonstrate this problem. So let's run this guy. And now we should see the book with the author. We no longer have a cycle. But if we query an author, for instance, let's take this one, we no longer get any books. Sometimes that's perfectly fine. Sometimes we don't want to return all the books for a certain author. Yeah, that would be possible, but it is definitely not the way that we want it here. We want to have both ways. We want to have a list of books for the author, and we want to have the author for each book. So the current solution works in a very simplified requirement, but in real life, this does not work as expected. So the problem is that there isn't a really good solution in ASP.NET Core 3. There will be a much better solution in ASP.NET Core 3.1, but in 3.0, unfortunately, we have to make two important changes. I will add these changes to your cheat sheet so you can simply copy them. So what you have to do is the following. Please follow along. Please right-click on the project here and go to Manage Nougat Packages. The Nougat package that we are looking for is called Microsoft.ASP.NET Core MVC Newtonsoft JSON. This is the Nougat package that we are looking for, and please install this Nougat package to your project. As I told you, this will not be necessary in upcoming versions of ASP.NET Core 3.1, for instance, but currently it's the better option to solve all these cycle project problems. Once you have added this, you can go to add controllers here in the startup CS and say .add Newtonsoft JSON. See this one? And here we get some settings, and these settings, they allow us to set some options. Where is it? Here, serialize the settings. Here, reference loop handling, and we can say reference loop handling ignore. And with that, we have solved the whole loop error. Now we are allowed to have loops in our modal for ASP.NET Core. So we can reintroduce the books here and everything still works. Let's give it a try and let's see if this really works. We run the application in the debugger. Good. We go here and we'll see whether we get the author's data. Waiting. Yes, it still works. Books are not there yet. We will fix that in a second. And books. And you will see it still works. So we have gotten rid of the problem with the cycle. So let's fix the last problem here, because can you remember in the authors we had here in the get method, in the books, we had here in the method this include author, and now we can do the other way around. We can say when we read the authors, we also want to include the books. Now we have it in both directions. Let's try it. Go back to Visual Studio Code. Let's look for the author. We get the author. Let's look for the authors. Here we are, all the authors. And we'll see Foo Bar has already a book. John Doe doesn't have a book, works in this direction. And if we take a look at the books, we also get the author for the book. So as you can see here, it is very, very nice in ASP.NET Core to build an entity framework-based controller systems. Let's quickly recap what we did, and based on this information, it should be possible for you to work on the bike rental example. I will close all my windows here to give you a recap of what we did. Step 1, we created a new ASP.NET Core app, this one. Then we added the Modal. The Modal classes, here they are, with some primary key information, with some data annotations, and with some referential information like an author has many books or a book has an author. Just plain CLR classes, nothing special. The next step was creating the book context. Very simple. For every table, we have a DB set. Copy this code from the cheat sheet. If you are not sure, you don't need to remember that by heart. In real life, you will also look it up in the documentation. Therefore, we have the cheat sheet. Once we have the database context, we have to go into the settings file and add the connection string to our SQL server. Startup class then connects our configuration information with our database context by registering the database context for dependency injection. If you have done that, we have created the migrations and so on. I'm sure you can remember that one. But the important thing of this lesson, the important takeaway is that you do not need to now write all the necessary methods like adding data, deleting data, updating data, reading data by hand, but you just right-click on the controllers, say add controller, choose the API controller, choose the table for which you want to create a new controller, and that's it. You are done. You might need to add some slight modifications like the include clause. I demonstrated that to you, but that's not a must. That's even optional. That saves you a lot of time, and that's important when it comes to the exam and your Matura. So please give it a try, add the necessary controllers, build your application, and try to run it from within Visual Studio Code. I hope you can recap the things that I showed you here. If not, rewind the video, play it again, and try to fix all your problems. If you have continuous problems, ask your peers or send me an email and I will try to get back to you as soon as possible. I hope this lesson was interesting. I hope you could follow along. I wish you a very nice day and I'm looking forward to seeing you all next week. Goodbye for today.